The subject today is we're talking about risk. We're talking about cyber risk as such, and that risk, of course, is something that is there continuously, and it will help you. That's my goal of today, to help you to organize that risk in a way that you can manage that later on. And when you do such a thing, the first thing you might be interested in is to get an insight of that risk itself. And I really would advise you to start looking at what is called risk frameworks. One of them is covered by FAIR, which is mainly focusing on the analysis part. But such a risk framework will help you to analyze and also to construct the risk taxonomy. For instance, in this case, there's a risk taxonomy which is based on a piece of one side. There's a loss event and the frequency related to that, and the other one is, of course, a probability magnitude. What is the impact of the loss in a magnitude sense? You can divide both of them up into subcategories. As you can see, the loss event frequencies, there's a threat event and there's a vulnerability part, and in the loss there's a primary loss and a secondary loss. This way it helps you to modelize and to analyze such a typical risk, and it will help you also to identify, of course, stakeholders, the type of losses, and also the cost in many different aspects. So this is basically the setup of such a framework, and the risk is in this case, of course, the frequency and the magnitude to that specific loss in the future. So such a framework will give you kind of guidance on how risk is structured. So now let's briefly move on to basically the problem statement we have today. This problem statement that we have in organizations is that more and more of the organizations are, of course, networked. That means they are focused on both internal and external connections to many services, applications, but also people. More and more organizations do not stand on their own. That means they are connected to what is called extended enterprises. They are connected to vendors delivering services, or maybe you do business process outsourcing. Maybe you do application outsourcing. That means there's more and more networked relationships, and as such, you need to manage that as well. Next to that, also the attacks are becoming more and more complex. That means I'm not only talking about purely IT or application or networking attacks. I'm also talking about social engineering activities that people do in order to get into your organization and to get access to your systems. And so that means it's more and more than only IT. And most approaches we have today are focusing on that IT part. That means it's mostly in a bottom-up approach, focusing on firewall rules or that kind of content approaches, but that doesn't help to cover the complete area. So more and more you see that risk is basically much more spread out over multiple layers, and the question is, of course, can the current situation, can the current management handle that type of complexity? And then the other question, of course, is where do you start in such a case? So I would like to help you a little bit with that. So if you're in this area, if you're working inside this area, maybe you're working already in maybe the IT security part, but it's just one area. It's focusing on the complete enterprise. So the approach actually that we would like to basically address with you is to have an integral vision actually on that security or risk management activity. By the identification, of course, of risks and the analysis related to that in a very structured way. And that's also why I started out with that model. That model that will help you to get an idea of what that risk really resembles and how it's constructed from both the loss part as well as the frequency that can be occurring. So basically, having that analysis and risk analysis done, then of course there is a linking pin to I would say the security strategy, which maybe already is in your place in your company. Maybe you already have a business continuity plan. Maybe you can already leverage existing frameworks inside. Anyway, you try to get up a risk management in a proper way, because in the end, of course, it is about mitigation. How many activities can you do in order to reduce the risk that you are facing? That's basically the approach, and in this presentation, I would like to show you what architecture really can, how it can help you in this situation, in this problem statement. And that's basically what we are going to look at. I will dive into a couple of models later on. But this is basically the approach. Let's first talk a little bit about that enterprise architecture. What is that about? Maybe some people of you are familiar with that already. Some of you might not be understanding that complete context. Enterprise architecture is about basically two parts. In the end, architecture is something that your organization is consisting of. So that means your organization is consisting from a business architecture, being the processes, the functions, with underlying application components, applications doing their information work, and below that, I would say there would be most likely be an infrastructure. That's basically the architecture of the organization. That means there's always an architecture, no matter if you do that actively or not. And that enterprise architecture resembles the whole structure of that organization. Now, basically, there's two things to tell you about our enterprise architecture. First of all, if you're always doing architecture work, maybe you don't do it consciously, but you always make changes to the organization continuously, and therefore you're doing architecture changes. You can do that in a very organized way. Then, in that case, you have an architecture process, and then we end up in an activity which is called architecting. And that means that you make models and decisions, and you make coherent descriptions of the architecture in order to make proper decisions for all the stakeholders that are involved in that decision. Another thing that comes out of that process, so the result of that process, is of course the architecture itself. That means in the end you make changes, and later on, of course, your projects basically implement that type of change. So that's the two things about enterprise architecture. Well, a process that can be used for that architecture work. So I'm moving now to the left side. Is of course Togaf. Togaf consists out of a framework consisting out of a process as well. So a process for development of architecture. And this process is called ADM, Architecture Development Method. And you can see that one here below. Consisting out of a couple of phases. That's what these circles are called, phases, and they represent activities that you do inside that architecture project. Next to that, basically the architecture comes out, and the architecture can be visualized in many ways. You can make complete descriptions, of course, but you can also model that architecture. And there's a modeling language, ArchiMate, that will help you to model that piece of architecture. And that's basically what you see on the right-hand side. This is a small version. We will dive into that in more details later on. But I just want you to understand that enterprise architecture is really about the process of doing enterprise architecture work, in order to get stakeholders confirming their changes, and also to make sure that their viewpoints are covered. And next to that, of course, you create architectures, and architectures can be visualized in a way to make that make the stakeholders understand the architectures and the changes that are needed, and the changes that have their impact on their specific concerns. So this is basically the background of enterprise architecture. Now, why would that help us in our context? We will dive into that later, but I first want you to understand how Togaf and actually ArchiMate fit together, in order to understand that in a later step to move to a more detailed explanation of what I'm doing with the ArchiMate modeling. So to get started, actually, is actually that I would like to show you the ADM. That's the process model. The process model consists out of a couple of phases. One of the phases where we do architecture development. That's this one, and this one is actually the BCD is about architecture development phases, and these ones are about implementation. You can also see that because if you look at the ArchiMate levels, you can see that the three of them are focusing on business application technology layers, which are architecture domains. And the red and the purple ones are focusing on implementation and also the motivation extension. And one of the interesting things is that today I'm going to look at the motivation extension to help you to cover these or to address the risks that you run into, and also how to address them. So ArchiMate and Togaf fit together as such. One is doing the process, the decision making, and the other one is actually making a kind of model into different areas of interest. Yeah. So that's basically it. Motivation, as you can see, in Togaf consists out of a couple of things actually. It starts with basically addressing, of course, the goals that you have, the drivers, the stakeholders, all these things that have relevance to the motivation behind the change that you're undergoing. And that is, of course, important when we move into security and risk management as well. So the approach actually that I would like to show you today is that we have 6 steps to move to complete that approach. First of all, we start to identify the threats that we have. Then we do an assessment in order to identify what type of risk are we talking about, based on the threats. Then we define controls in order to mitigate or to control that specific risk. Then we implement the controls, of course, in order to manage that thing. Then we monitor the controls, and in the end, of course, we analyze the vulnerabilities that are still left in that situation. Yeah, so by doing so, we can do it completely inside a modeling tool, because this motivation, of course, extension will help us to address all that. Now, before we dive into the example of this inside this context, I first would like to show you something. Some background on the motivation extension in ArchiMate. And in order to do that, I move to my modeling tool. So I start with a blank canvas, and I enlarge the screen a little bit to make it better readable. So actually, this is a modeling tool for ArchiMate. What you can see here, simply ArchiMate, and what you can see on this slide is actually the different layers in architecture work. So when you're doing enterprise architecture, you're mainly focusing on business architecture, on applications, and on technology. And these all represent, of course, specific meaning inside that specific layer. So, for instance, I could show you a business service by using this element, and I can easily make it, for instance, a customer complaint service. Yeah. So that's just an example. Today, actually, we're not going to look at the architecture layers, but we will look at the extensions. So that means there's an extension in red here, which is the extension for motivation. And here you can see a couple of things. For instance, I could model. So this has nothing primarily to do with architecture, but it has, of course, something to do with stakeholder management. I can model the stakeholders. And for instance, a stakeholder that I could have is a customer service manager. So this is the customer service manager, and he has a specific driver, and specific driver in this case is to keep customers happy, right? That's an important driver that he has, and combined with that, of course, there's a couple of goals that he likes to be addressed, because we know that happy customers in the end drive, of course, increasing sales, because another advantage, basically, or a goal we might have is to get returning customers. Yeah. So again, this has nothing to do with risk management, but it has something to do with stakeholder management. This is the stakeholder. He has a clear driver in order to reach certain goals. And the goals in this case are increasing sales and returning customers. Yeah. Now maybe I can do an assessment, and I can say, okay, assessment on customer services. That's what we do. Yeah, and we found out that a couple of new requirements need to be put in place. Yeah, so there's new requirements. That means less wait time, for instance, on the phone. Yeah. And we also found out during that assessment that I like to have a new requirement, which is called, let me put it here, which is called self-service. Yeah, I would like to implement self-service in order to have better, basically a better customer service. So this is basically a very simple model expressing the relationship between a stakeholder, yeah, and also a very clear requirement. And this is of course a very high level one. But you can imagine I can do this on multiple levels, and I can also assign this way the different goals, but also the different drivers that I have in order to meet that specific goal. So this is all in order to make you understand what this extension, this motivation extension in ArchiMate is really about, and that is a basic foundation actually of the next thing we will talk about, which is then the motivation in the case of doing that work inside the security area, or in vulnerability in this case. So that means we would like to move on to that part, and that helps us to that way actually we can do that by using an example, and I will show you that here. So if I go back now, basically I can use ArchiMate to model that type of risk that we're talking about, and also to make an approach towards that. So let me show you that in the ArchiMate tool to understand what it is about, and so that sorry for that. That is what we will show you in here. So basically, I will open up a model which I already made in this context, just to explain what we're doing here. I quickly want to show you what is the story. So I've talked about you with the 6 steps of the approach we will take in the risk. Well, just imagine yourself that there is in an organization there's a specific asset at risk. Yeah, and in this case, I took a very simple example, a business process. Yeah? So that means we did some research, we did some analysis, some assessments on the business process. Yeah? And I can change it. I can say, okay, this is the business process of finance. Sorry. Take customer intake. So that means this is a finance process, customer intake. Yeah. For example, we did a vulnerability scan, an assessment. Yeah. And the outcome is that depending on a specific type of attack, yeah, I will have a specific lost event, and that means there's a specific threat, yeah, that I can identify. And of course, I can use the model. I can use the model that I showed you earlier. The model that can be used to model that to do that risk analysis, which is part of the FAIR framework. It can be used in order to give you access to that identification of a threat. Yeah? Because in the end, a threat is not similar to a risk. You need to make an analysis on risk as well, to show what that type of risk for that business process in this case is. Yeah? So this model actually helps you to identify that risk in a very organized way. Sometimes you're talking about a process, and another time you're talking maybe about an application. Yeah? I will show you an example of that later on. So when we have that risk identified, of course, we want to address a specific what we call risk controls, in order to make sure that we have that goal set and that we know how to control this risk, not to mitigate it, to reduce the risk, and to make sure that we have an acceptable level. So that means in the end we have a deliverable, a requirement, a very clear requirement that makes sure that we manage this control in an organized way. Yeah, so maybe we put in place an extra business service, maybe we put an application in place to manage the risk of that business process. I have no clue. Or maybe we put a firewall rule in place. Yeah? But what you see here clearly is that we don't start from the bottom up, so we don't start with a firewall with rules and then move up to a specific risk. Now we start with the top-down approach. So we start with, for instance, a clearly identified business process, a vulnerability that we scan, and basically we continue to do this again and again in order to, of course, reduce that risk to an acceptable level. Yeah? So that is basically, in a nutshell, the approach for this way to model that in ArchiMate. The nice thing is that once you've done that, you can apply that, of course, to existing pieces of architecture work. So let me give you an example of such a thing, and I will reduce that in order to give you an overview. So so what do you see here? What you see here actually is an existing architecture of a piece of the organization. Yeah, and I will zoom in order to make it more clear for you. So starting with the yellow part, actually, or orange yellow part, is representing the business architecture layer. You can see that because here we're talking about a customer, we're talking about a customer service. The customer service that we have actually consists of two functions, as you can see. We have a customer complaint business function, and we have also a customer invoice questions. Yeah? You can see that there's a couple of processes below, which are represented by this arrow that is shown here. And you can see that behind the scenes, on a lower level of the architecture, there's applications that support these business processes. Yeah? We have a CRM application. We have an issue registration. Let me enlarge it a little bit for you to make it better readable. An issue registration app. We have an order logistics app, and we have a financial app. Yeah? Now, if we go a little bit down, we will also see the infrastructure layer, which is represented here by the green elements. And as you can see, we have one server which is running the both apps for CRM and issue registration. There's a logistics server which is running the logistics app, and a financial application which is running on the finance server. Yeah? Basically constructed from a couple of components. You can see that there's a physical element here. There's also a Red Hat operating system, a WebSphere, and all technical components. And maybe there's much more infrastructure layer which we didn't model because it has no relevance at the moment. Maybe if it did have relevance, then maybe we have to identify that, of course, and model it. Because maybe you need to show a network or a logical communication part, depending on what you want to show. So when using now this approach that I showed you earlier, of the vulnerability scan, the threat, the risk control, and then the requirements to manage that specific risk control. This should be risk control. then basically, what we can do now actually is do a vulnerability scan on different levels, because you can say, okay, I will do a penetration test, and that will give me all the answers. Well, that will surely give you all the answers when it comes to technology, but it will not give you the answers when it comes to social engineering. Yeah? So if there's a vulnerability which is residing on for instance, a process. So let me give you an example of such a thing. So suppose that we have a process which is called financial invoicing, and we'll find out that that there is some that it has some vulnerability that we identified, because these people are working with invoices, and they have the possibility to maybe modify existing invoices, and therefore can do some fraud, for instance. Well, in that case, you might be interested to look at these people, and these are the finance people. And so maybe then the scan is on this level. Yeah, so I'll make it a little bit purple to make clear that we talk about the same thing. And I will do my vulnerability check on that part. Yeah, so that means I will do that assessment there. Yeah, I'll make an association. It's not a beautiful picture at the moment, but you'll get the ID. We do a certain scan there. Yeah, we identify the threats that we have faced in that specific area. We do some risk control objectives. That means what is the risk that we try to control, and what is an acceptable level. What pure controls do we identify? So maybe we should do I don't know. Maybe you end up with some additional scans that you do to your personnel, to your employees. Maybe you do more checks with 2 people instead of that authorizations need to be done by 2 instead of 1, depending on what the outcome is, and of course that leads to some implementations, some requirements that we have to implement in that maybe process, yeah, or maybe you make changes in the end to, for instance, the financial app. Yeah. So it doesn't have to be, of course, that you implement it in the same level. Maybe you implement some additional features in the application, and therefore you cannot do that type of fraud anymore. It's very depending on, of course, what you scan. So this was an example of that social engineering, or maybe more concrete to fraud when it comes to people. It can also be, of course, that you are working on a specific IT level. So maybe there's an application that you need to do a scan of vulnerability scan on. And basically the application seems to be fine, and there's no problem inside that app. But you'll find out that there is some vulnerability, not in the application level, but maybe on the hosting level. And maybe you find out that some patches have not been installed, and that there's a vulnerability on that technology level. Yeah? But maybe you also find out that that's the data. For instance, the customer details. In this case, maybe this information is not encrypted in a database server, and you would like to see who is able to change that, and what vulnerabilities you're facing. Yeah. Then again, you do some threat analysis. What are the threats that you can have there? What is the risk that we really are facing? And what are the controls that we put in place in order to reduce that to an acceptable level? And that means that we need to implement something. Yeah? It could be that you do some audit trailing, or maybe you implement some encryption, or maybe you change the authorizations of the DBA people. It's very depending on your situation, but you can use the same approach, and that's the whole story about the webinar that we have today. You can use this approach and do this modeling technique to identify the vulnerabilities, the threats, the risks, and in order to put the specific controls in place. Yeah? So that's basically the ID, and of course you can make that. And the more you do that, the more assessments, of course, become a kind of a structured approach. And this way you can also identify what areas are covered and which areas not, because maybe you're focusing now on IT, very IT specific layers. Yeah? So, for instance, you might focus on only doing penetration testing on this level, which is fine. But maybe you forget about the application itself, or maybe you forget about the data, or maybe you forget about the layers on top of that. So this method actually helps you to do that, and that's basically what I want to share with you today. And so I think it's a nice way to get that in place and to get that working inside your organization. If you're interested, we did a couple of these exercises with companies, and of course we're happy to support you in that. But I would like to show you what the background of this is, and because maybe that can help you as well with doing that type of work. So that was basically the background of this presentation.